A man gave away his only proof he mattered. 20 years ago, Sergeant William O'Connor placed his Medal of Honor into the hands of a widow whose husband never came home, believing some sacrifices are too sacred to be worn by the living. He walked away lighter, emptier, convinced his story ended the moment he stopped being a hero. But across 2 decades, a boy grew into the President of the United States, carrying his father's memory like a torch through corridors of power. Now, in a ceremony that will shatter the silence William built around himself, that president will return what was never truly given away. And William will finally learn that honor does not fade when shared. It multiplies in the hearts of those who witness it. Subscribe to discover how one gesture became a legacy that refused to die. The rain fell softly on Des Moines that October afternoon, 20 years ago, each drop a tiny ghost tapping against the windows of the modest funeral home, where grief gathered like humidity in the corners of every room. William O'Connor stood near the back wall, his 75-year-old frame slightly bent, as though the air itself pressed down on his shoulders, his calloused hands folded in front of his worn suit jacket that smelled faintly of mothballs and memory. He had come alone, as he always did to these gatherings, because solitude had become his most faithful companion since the war ended and the world moved forward without pausing to notice who stayed behind. The casket at the front of the room held Private Daniel Carter, a young soldier whose face William had never seen, except in the photograph now displayed on an easel beside white lilies already browning at the edges. The widow sat in the first row, her back rigid with the kind of grief that refuses to bend. Her son, no more than 8 years old, pressed against her side like a small anchor, trying to keep her from drifting into the void that had opened beneath her feet. William watched them from his distance, feeling the familiar ache that came whenever he witnessed the aftermath of sacrifice, the kind of loss that carved itself into the marrow of those left behind and never truly healed, only scabbed over with time and routine and the necessity of continuing to breathe. He had brought the medal with him, tucked inside the inner pocket of his jacket, where it rested against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The ribbon faded from decades of careful storage in a drawer he rarely opened, because looking at it always summoned the faces of men who never made it home. The Medal of Honor had been given to him 53 years earlier, for actions he still could not speak about without feeling the cold sweat of remembered terror sliding down his spine. For a day when the world narrowed to blood and smoke and the screaming of men whose names he whispered in his sleep long after their bodies had been buried in foreign soil. He had accepted it with trembling hands, young and bewildered by the weight of recognition, believing then that medals meant something, that they could somehow balance the scales of who lived and who died, and why fate made such arbitrary distinctions. But the decades had taught him differently, had worn away the shine of pride until all that remained was a deep, abiding sense that survival itself was not heroism, but a kind of cosmic accident, and that wearing a medal for living while others died felt less like honor and more like theft. So he had carried it with him today, this small piece of metal and fabric that represented everything he no longer believed he deserved, because he had read about Private Carter in the newspaper, a young man who threw himself on a grenade to save his unit. The kind of sacrifice that left no room for doubt or ambiguity, the kind of death that made William's own survival feel like a failure of courage by comparison. The ceremony began with words that floated past him like smoke, the chaplain's voice a low drone of comfort and scripture that meant nothing to the widow, whose shoulders shook with silent sobs, whose son stared straight ahead with eyes too old for his small face. William barely heard the eulogies, the stories of Daniel Carter's kindness and bravery, the way his letters home always spoke of his love for his wife and his hopes for his son's future. The dreams that would never unfold beyond the pages of those final correspondences, now kept in a shoebox under the widow's bed. He waited until the formal proceedings ended, until the crowd thinned and people began filtering out into the grey afternoon, their obligations fulfilled, their discomfort with mortality satisfied for another season. Only then did William approach the widow, his steps slow and deliberate, his heart pounding with a kind of terror he had not felt since the war, because what he was about to do felt like severing the last thread connecting him to the man he used to believe himself to be. She looked up as he neared, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted, and he saw in her face the same expression he had seen in mirrors for decades, the look of someone who has survived something unsurvivable and does not know whether that makes them blessed or cursed. Her son remained at her side, small and watchful, his hand clutching the fabric of her black dress as though afraid she might dissolve if he let go. William introduced himself quietly, his voice rough from disuse and emotion, explaining that he had been a soldier too, that he understood in some small measure what her husband had given and what she had lost. The widow nodded, polite but distant, trapped in the fog of fresh grief that makes every interaction feel like it is happening on the other side of thick glass. He did not prolong the conversation, did not try to offer platitudes that would ring hollow in the cavern of her sorrow, but instead reached into his jacket and withdrew the small velvet box that held his Medal of Honor, the ribbon still crisp despite its age, the medal itself polished to a shine he had maintained out of habit rather than pride. He opened the box slowly, letting her see what lay inside, and then he said the words he had rehearsed in his mind during the long drive to Des Moines, though they came out rougher and more broken than he had intended. "Your husband was the real hero," he told her, his voice barely above a whisper, each syllable weighted with 50 years of survivor's guilt and the desperate need to make someone understand that some deaths mean more than some lives. "He gave everything. I just kept breathing. I want you to have this, for him, for what he did, because he earned it more than I ever did." The widow stared at the medal, her expression shifting from confusion to something deeper, something that looked almost like pain, mixed with a strange, terrible understanding. She did not reach for it immediately, and in that hesitation, William saw the enormity of what he was trying to give her, not just a piece of metal, but the last tangible proof that his life had meant something, the only object that connected him to a version of himself that once believed in clear definitions of right and wrong, heroism and cowardice. He pressed the box into her hands before she could refuse, his fingers trembling as they released their hold, and he felt something inside him crack open like ice, breaking over deep water. The widow's son looked up at him then, his young eyes searching William's face with an intensity that made the old veteran's breath catch. And William wondered what the boy saw there, whether he recognized the hollowness, the self-erasure, the desperate hope that giving away this medal might somehow balance an equation that had never made sense. The widow finally closed her fingers around the box, tears spilling down her cheeks in silent rivers, and she whispered a thank you that sounded more like a question, as though she could not quite believe what had just happened or what it meant. William nodded once, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat, and then he turned and walked away, his steps quick and unsteady, his hands empty of everything except the cold air, and the sense that he had just severed the final cord, tying him to the idea that his survival had purpose or meaning beyond the simple, brutal fact of his continued existence. Outside, the rain had intensified, soaking through his thin jacket within moments, but William barely noticed the cold or the wet, or the way water streamed down his face like the tears he refused to let fall. He climbed into his old truck, the engine coughing to life after several attempts, And he sat there for a long time, with his hands on the steering wheel, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at nothing in particular. The emptiness in his chest where the medal had rested felt vast and echoless, a cavity that would never be filled again because he had chosen to give away the only thing that ever made him feel like he mattered, like his survival was justified by something larger than random chance. He told himself it was the right thing to do, that the widow and her son needed that symbol more than he did, that honor should belong to the dead who earned it through ultimate sacrifice rather than the living who merely endured. But as he drove home through the darkening afternoon, the highway blurring into streaks of grey and black, he could not shake the feeling that he had just erased himself from history, that without the medal, he was nothing more than another old man waiting for death in a country that had long ago forgotten the wars he fought and the men who never came home. And in that moment, as the rain pounded against metal and glass, William O'Connor accepted what he believed to be an immutable truth, that his story had ended the day he gave away his medal, and that whatever years remained would be lived in the quiet obscurity of the forgotten, with no one to remember his name or care that he had once been deemed worthy of honor by a nation that had since moved on to newer wars and younger heroes. The years that followed William's gesture unfolded with the slow, grinding inevitability of erosion, each day wearing away another small piece of the man he used to be, until what remained felt less like a person and more like a collection of habits wrapped in aging skin. He lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Cedar Rapids, a structure that had belonged to his parents and still bore traces of their existence, his mother's floral curtains yellowed by decades of sunlight, his father's tools rusting in the garage, photographs on the mantel showing versions of William from before the war, when his eyes still held light and his smile did not look like something painted on for the benefit of others. The house had become both refuge and prison, a place where time moved differently, where hours could pass in complete silence, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional creak of floorboards settling into their familiar grooves. He filled his days with routines that required no thought: coffee at dawn, a walk around the neighborhood if his knees allowed, lunch at noon consisting of whatever required minimal preparation, afternoons spent in the garden where he grew tomatoes and beans with a dedication that bordered on obsession, evenings in front of the television watching programs he never remembered the next morning. It was a life stripped of narrative, a series of repetitive actions that kept his body moving while his mind drifted through landscapes of memory he could neither fully inhabit nor entirely escape. The neighborhood knew him only as the quiet old man who kept to himself, who nodded politely when passing on the sidewalk, but never initiated conversation, whose house remained dark most evenings, except for the blue glow of the television, visible through gaps in those faded curtains. He had no close friends, no family beyond a few distant cousins. He exchanged Christmas cards with out of obligation rather than affection, no connections to anchor him to the present moment or give him reason to believe tomorrow would differ from today. The absence of the medal had created a strange void in his identity, a blank space where purpose used to live, and he found himself unable to explain to anyone, not that anyone asked, what he had done or why he had done it, because the gesture itself had become too entangled with shame and resignation to be articulated in words that made sense outside his own head. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep refused to come and the darkness pressed against the windows like a physical weight, he would think about the widow and her son, wondering if they had kept the medal or sold it, whether it brought them any comfort or if it sat in a drawer somewhere gathering dust the way his own had for so many years. He never tried to find out, never reached out or followed up, because to do so would have been to admit that he needed validation for his sacrifice. And that need felt like proof of his unworthiness, evidence that he had given the medal away, not out of genuine selflessness, but out of some twisted desire to be seen as noble by strangers who would never know his name. His health declined in the imperceptible way that aging bodies do. Joints stiffening until morning required a slow, painful negotiation with gravity. Medications multiplying on the bathroom counter until he could no longer remember what each pill was for, only that the doctor insisted he take them with breakfast and dinner. He walked with a slight limp now, the result of an old injury that had seemed minor at the time, but had calcified over decades into chronic pain that flared with changes in weather and made sleep difficult on cold nights when his bones ached with remembered trauma. His hands, once steady enough to thread needles and field strip rifles in darkness, now trembled when he tried to pour coffee or button his shirts. The small indignities of deterioration that reminded him daily that his body was preparing for an exit, his mind had not yet fully accepted. He began to lose track of time in ways that frightened him, waking up unsure if it was morning or afternoon, forgetting which day of the week it was, occasionally finding himself in rooms with no memory of why he had gone there or what he had intended to do once he arrived. The present became increasingly difficult to hold on to, slippery as water through his fingers, while the past grew more vivid and insistent, pushing into his waking hours with the force of hallucination, faces of dead men appearing in crowds, voices calling his name from empty rooms, dreams so real he would wake up expecting to find himself back in the mud and blood of battles fought before most people alive today were even born. Yet beneath the slow dissolution of body and mind, beneath the routines and the silence and the gathering fog of memory, there remained a small, stubborn core of awareness that watched everything with detached curiosity, as though William had split into two people, the one who moved through days like a sleepwalker, and the one who observed that sleepwalker with a mixture of pity and bemusement. This watching self kept a kind of vigil, noting each new failure of the physical form, each slippage of cognition, each moment when the world felt slightly less real than it had the day before. It was this self that sometimes wondered if he had made a mistake, if giving away the medal had been an act of courage or cowardice, martyrdom or self-destruction, and whether there was any meaningful difference between those categories in the end. He did not regret his choice exactly, but he mourned it, in the way one mourns an irreversible decision whose consequences only become clear years after the point of no return, when all that remains is to live inside the reality you created and try not to think too hard about the alternative paths that closed off the moment you committed to one direction over all the others. The medal had been his last connection to a larger narrative, to the idea that his life formed part of a story worth telling, and without it, he felt like a footnote that had been edited out of the final draft, present only in the white space between paragraphs, invisible and easily overlooked. His isolation deepened as neighbors moved away or died, as the world outside his windows transformed into something he no longer recognized, new technologies he did not understand, social norms that seemed to shift with bewildering speed, a culture that valued youth and innovation and had no patience for old men whose best years were buried in conflicts most people knew only from history books and Hollywood simplifications. He watched the news with a kind of numb horror, seeing young soldiers deployed to wars he could not quite distinguish from the one he had fought. The same rhetoric about freedom and sacrifice and necessary violence. And he wondered if anything ever really changed, or if history was just an endless loop of the same tragedies played out with different actors on different stages, while the script remained fundamentally unchanged. He wanted to believe his war had meant something, that the deaths he witnessed and the friends he lost and the piece of himself he left behind in foreign soil had purchased some kind of lasting peace or progress. But the evidence before him suggested otherwise, suggested that violence only ever begat more violence in an unbreakable chain stretching back to the beginning of human consciousness and forward into a future he would not live to see but could already predict with depressing accuracy. And in his darkest moments, when the weight of years and loneliness and physical decay pressed down with crushing force, William wondered if his greatest act of courage had not been surviving the war, but rather continuing to survive after it ended, waking up each morning despite having no compelling reason to do so, performing the rituals of existence even as existence itself became increasingly hollow and meaningless, a testament not to resilience but to the simple, mindless persistence of biological life long after the spirit has given up trying to find purpose in continuation. The house grew quieter as his own voice fell silent, days passing without him speaking aloud except to mutter responses at the television or curse his stiff joints when getting out of bed. And in that silence, something began to calcify around him like a shell, a protective barrier against further pain that also served to seal him off from any possibility of connection or redemption. He became a ghost in his own life, a man who had given away his proof of existence and now existed only in the liminal space between memory and forgetting, significant to no one, including himself, waiting without hope or fear for the moment when his body would finally surrender to entropy and release him from the exhausting labor of continuing to breathe in a world that had no place for men like him, who carried their wars inside them like shrapnel that could never be fully removed, only endured until it finally worked its way to some vital organ and finished the job it started decades before. And so the years passed, each one a little harder than the last, each day a small rehearsal for the final disappearance, until William O'Connor had almost succeeded in erasing himself entirely from the living record of the world. Convinced that his story had ended 20 years ago in a funeral home in Des Moines, when he placed his Medal of Honor into trembling hands and walked away into the rain, never imagining that across those same 20 years, a small boy was growing into a man who would remember, who would carry that gesture forward like a torch through darkness, who would one day hold enough power to reach back across time and pull William out of his self-imposed exile into a light he never expected to see again. The boy, whose name was Marcus Carter, had been 8 years old when his father's casket was lowered into the ground, and an old veteran with trembling hands had given his mother a medal that gleamed like a captured star in its velvet box. He remembered the rain, how it had turned the cemetery grass into mud that sucked at his shoes, remembered the hollow sound of dirt hitting wood when they filled in the grave, remembered most of all the way his mother had cried without making any sound, her whole body shaking with grief that had nowhere to go except inward, where it would settle like sediment in her bones for the rest of her life. But what stayed with him most vividly across the years was the face of the old man who had approached them after everyone else had left, whose eyes held a kind of desperate sadness that frightened Marcus in ways he could not articulate, whose voice, when he spoke about heroism and sacrifice, sounded like someone confessing to a crime they did not commit but believed themselves guilty of anyway. Marcus had watched his mother accept the medal, had seen her fingers close around the box as though it were a fragile bird that might fly away if she did not hold it carefully, and he had felt something shift inside himself, some understanding too large for his child's mind to fully grasp, but which lodged itself deep in his consciousness, like a seed that would take decades to germinate. His mother kept the medal on the mantel in their small apartment in Des Moines, displayed in a shadow box alongside his father's photograph and the folded flag from the funeral, objects that became the family's secular altar, the place Marcus would find her standing late at night when she thought he was asleep, her fingers pressed against the glass as though trying to touch something that existed just beyond reach. She never sold it, never hid it away, and she told Marcus stories about the old veteran who had given it to them. Stories she constructed from the few minutes of their interaction and from research she did later, when curiosity drove her to libraries and archives, where she learned that Sergeant William O'Connor had earned his Medal of Honor in Korea, that he had saved 6 men under heavy fire, that he had carried 2 wounded soldiers through enemy territory for 3 days before reaching friendly lines, that newspapers had called him a hero, and photographs from that era showed a young man with a straight spine and clear eyes, who looked nothing like the bent, haunted figure who had stood before them in the funeral home. She told Marcus that what William had done was a sacred act, that giving away his medal meant more than earning it in the first place, because it took greater courage to release glory than to claim it, and she insisted that they would honor this gift by living lives worthy of such sacrifice, by never forgetting that someone they did not know had cared enough about their grief to give away the most precious thing he owned. Marcus carried these stories with him as he grew, the memory of the old veteran becoming a kind of moral compass that guided his decisions during the difficult years of adolescence and early adulthood, when the absence of a father created a vacuum in his identity that threatened to collapse into bitterness or rage. He excelled in school partly to honor his mother's expectations, but mostly to honor the nameless weight of obligation that came with living under the shadow of that medal, knowing that it represented not just his father's sacrifice, but the veterans as well, a double inheritance of courage that made his own struggles feel small and manageable by comparison. He went to law school, driven by an idealistic belief that justice could be pursued through institutions if only good people worked hard enough to make them function as they were designed, and he found himself drawn to public service, to the idea that individual lives could be amplified through policy and leadership in ways that created ripples extending far beyond personal experience. His mother lived long enough to see him elected to the state legislature, died before he ran for governor, and in her final weeks she made him promise that he would find the old veteran someday, that he would tell William O'Connor how much his gift had meant, how it had shaped Marcus into the man he became, how his sacrifice was the foundation upon which their family had rebuilt itself from ruins. But life moved quickly once Marcus entered politics, each position leading to the next with a momentum that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, campaigns and legislation and compromises consuming his days until years had passed without him thinking about the promise he made to his dying mother, without him taking any concrete steps to locate William O'Connor or fulfill the obligation that had grown increasingly urgent as his own power and influence expanded. He carried the memory like guilt, like a debt unpaid, and sometimes late at night, when the demands of public life allowed brief moments of introspection, he would think about the old man and wonder if he was still alive, if he had spent the intervening decades regretting his gesture or finding peace in it, if he had any idea that the boy who witnessed his sacrifice had grown into someone who could now speak to millions, who commanded attention and resources beyond what that 8-year-old self could have possibly imagined. The medal still existed in Marcus's possession, retrieved from his mother's effects after her death and kept in a safe deposit box along with other family treasures. And he would occasionally visit it, open the velvet box, and stare at the ribbon and metal as though they could speak to him across time, as though the object itself held answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate about duty and honor, and the mysterious ways that one person's actions could echo through decades and shape destinies they would never witness. When Marcus ran for president, he did so with the explicit purpose of honoring those who served, of reforming the systems that sent young men and women to die in wars, whose justifications crumbled under the weight of time and scrutiny, of making sure that sacrifice meant something beyond political rhetoric and empty ceremonies. His campaign speeches frequently referenced his father's death, but he never mentioned the medal or the veteran who gave it away, keeping that story private as though it were too sacred to be weaponized for electoral gain, too personal to be transformed into a soundbite or a moment of calculated emotional manipulation. But he thought about it constantly during those brutal months of primaries and debates and endless travel, the image of William O'Connor's face surfacing in his mind during moments of exhaustion or doubt, reminding him why he had entered public service in the first place, what this entire endeavor was supposed to be about beneath the strategy and the polling data and the necessary compromises of coalition building. And when he won, when the networks called the race and the reality of his victory settled over him like a weight that was simultaneously crushing and elevating, the first thing he thought about was not the power he would wield or the policies he could implement, but rather the promise he had made to his mother and the debt he owed to an old man who had no idea that his single act of generosity 20 years earlier had set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in this moment, in the boy he tried to comfort becoming the President of the United States. The transition period was chaos, a whirlwind of appointments and briefings and preparations that left Marcus with almost no time for personal matters. But he insisted that his staff make finding William O'Connor a priority, tasking his personal aide with tracking down the veteran who had given away his medal 2 decades earlier in a funeral home in Des Moines. The search took weeks, complicated by the passage of time and the fact that William had lived so quietly that he left almost no paper trail beyond basic records, no social media presence, no interviews or public appearances, just the bare minimum documentation of a life lived in deliberate obscurity. But eventually they found him, still alive at 95, still living alone in the same small house in Cedar Rapids, still moving through his days with the slow determination of a man who has outlived all his contemporaries and most of his reasons for continuing, but continues anyway out of simple biological habit. Marcus felt an overwhelming surge of relief when he learned William was alive, followed immediately by a deep anxiety about what he would say, how he would explain what that gift had meant, whether words could possibly bridge the gap between the old man's sacrifice and the gratitude Marcus felt but had never properly expressed. He decided that a private visit would be wrong, that this needed to be public, witnessed, a moment that honored not just William, but everyone who had ever made sacrifices that went unrecognized, whose generosity disappeared into the anonymous currents of history without acknowledgement or celebration. And so he began planning a ceremony, working with his staff to coordinate a public event that would return the Medal of Honor to its original recipient and, in doing so, tell a story about grace and memory, and the mysterious ways that kindness compounds across time until its returns are beyond calculation or comprehension. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, sliding through the mail slot of William's front door and landing on the worn welcome mat with a soft thud that he almost did not hear over the hiss of water filling his coffee pot in the kitchen. He retrieved it slowly, his arthritic fingers struggling with the envelope's seal, his eyes squinting at the official letterhead that declared this correspondence came from the office of the President of the United States. Words that his mind initially refused to process because they made no sense in the context of his small, forgotten life. He read the contents 3 times before the meaning penetrated the fog of disbelief, each reading bringing new waves of confusion and something that felt almost like panic, because the letter explained, in formal, respectful language that somehow made the impossibility more surreal, that President Marcus Carter wished to meet with him, that a car would arrive next week to transport him to Washington for a ceremony in his honor, that his presence was requested but not required, though the president hoped very much that William would accept this invitation to participate in an event of personal significance. The letter did not specify what the ceremony would entail, offered no details beyond logistical arrangements and assurances that all his needs would be accommodated, but William's hands shook so badly as he held the paper that the words blurred into illegible shapes, and he had to sit down in the nearest chair before his legs gave out beneath him. For hours he sat there, the letter clutched in his trembling fingers, his mind spinning through possibilities and memories, trying to understand what this meant and why. After so many years of silence, anyone would want to acknowledge his existence, let alone the President of the United States. The name Marcus Carter triggered something in his memory, a familiarity he could not immediately place. And it took him most of the morning to make the connection, to remember the small boy who had stood beside his mother at the funeral, whose young face had watched William with those two knowing eyes as he gave away his medal. The realization, when it came, felt like being struck by lightning, electricity coursing through his body and short-circuiting the resigned acceptance he had built around himself like armor against further pain. That boy had become the president. The child he had tried to comfort in some small way had risen to the highest office in the nation, and now, for reasons William could not begin to fathom, wanted to see him, wanted to honor him in some public way that made William's stomach churn with anxiety and something darker, something that felt like shame, because he did not deserve honor, had never deserved it, had given away his medal precisely because he understood his own unworthiness, and could not bear to keep wearing a symbol that made other people believe he was something he knew himself not to be. He almost did not respond, almost threw the letter away and pretended it never arrived, because the prospect of leaving his house, of traveling to Washington, of standing before cameras and crowds while people who did not know him applauded for reasons that felt fundamentally false, seemed worse than death, more terrifying than any battle he had ever fought. But something stopped him from refusing, whether it was curiosity or a sense of obligation, or the faint, desperate hope that maybe this meant his life had not been entirely meaningless after all. And he found himself calling the number provided in the letter, speaking to a polite aide who confirmed the arrangements with an efficiency that suggested this kind of call was routine, that presidential invitations were extended and accepted so frequently that William's participation was just another item on a long checklist of tasks to be completed before the event. The aide explained that a car would collect him in 5 days, that he should pack for an overnight stay, though he would be returned home the following evening, that medical personnel would be on hand if he needed any assistance given his age and health conditions, and that the president was very much looking forward to meeting him. William agreed to everything in a daze, his voice sounding strange and distant in his own ears, and when he hung up the phone, he sat in silence for a long time, trying to understand what he had just committed to and whether he had the courage to actually follow through, or if he would call back tomorrow and cancel, invent some medical emergency that made travel impossible, retreat back into the safety of his obscurity, where no one expected anything from him except continued breathing. The days before his departure were torturous, each hour stretching into something gelatinous and hard to move through, his mind cycling between anticipation and dread without ever settling into anything resembling peace. He told no one about the invitation because there was no one to tell, his isolation so complete that even news this extraordinary had no audience beyond the walls of his small house. He tried to imagine what the ceremony would involve, what words the president might say, what he himself would be expected to do or say in response. But every scenario he constructed felt absurd, theatrical, fundamentally disconnected from the reality of who he actually was, a 95-year-old man who had spent the last 2 decades trying to disappear, who had given away his medal, because he believed himself unworthy of recognition, whose entire adult life had been an exercise in self-erasure so thorough that being suddenly visible again felt like violence against the person he had worked so hard to become. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and saw a stranger, an old man whose face was a topographical map of wrinkles and age spots, whose eyes looked back with an expression he could not quite read, and he wondered what the president would see when they met. Whether Marcus Carter would be disappointed to discover that the man he wanted to honor was just this: a collection of failing systems and fading memories, nothing heroic or noble. Just the ordinary detritus of a long life, lived without particular distinction after that one day in Korea, when circumstances forced him to be brave, because there was no other option available except death or cowardice. He slept poorly those final nights, his dreams populated by fragments of the past and anxious projections of the future, waking at odd hours, drenched in sweat and disoriented, unsure where he was or what year it was, his mind slipping through time with the unsettling fluidity that had become increasingly common as his body deteriorated. He would lie in the darkness and think about the medal, about the moment he gave it away, and the certainty he had felt then that he was doing the right thing, that the gesture would bring some small measure of comfort to a grieving family, and simultaneously release him from the burden of pretending he was someone worth celebrating. But now, facing the prospect of the medal's return, he felt only confusion and fear. Because if Marcus Carter gave it back, what did that mean? That the sacrifice had been rejected? That his gesture was being reinterpreted as something other than what he intended? That he would be forced to accept recognition he had spent 20 years trying to avoid, forced to wear a symbol he no longer believed he had any right to claim. The questions circled like vultures, picking at the exposed bones of his sense of self, and by the time the car arrived on the appointed morning, William felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except a numb determination to see this through, because he had already said yes, and did not know how to take it back without seeming ungrateful or cowardly. And whatever else he might be, he did not want to be remembered as a man who could not face the consequences of his own actions, even when those consequences arrived decades late and wearing the face of forgiveness he never asked for and did not believe he deserved. The car was black and sleek, driven by a silent man in a dark suit who helped William into the back seat with professional courtesy, and then said nothing for the entire drive to the private airfield, where a small plane waited on the tarmac, its engines humming with mechanical patience. William had never flown in a private aircraft before, had rarely flown at all beyond his military transport decades ago, and the experience of being escorted up the narrow stairs and settled into a leather seat that smelled of wealth and power felt surreal, as though he had crossed into a parallel dimension where men like him were treated with deference instead of being invisible to everyone except other ghosts. A flight attendant offered him water, coffee, a selection of pastries he did not want but accepted out of politeness, and as the plane lifted into the grey February sky, William pressed his face to the window and watched Iowa shrink beneath him, the patchwork fields and winding roads becoming abstract patterns that bore no relationship to the life he had lived down there in the dirt and detail of ordinary days. He felt unmoored, suspended between earth and heaven in a liminal space where the rules of his existence no longer applied. And he wondered if this was what dying would feel like, a lifting away from everything familiar, a transition into territory where the coordinates of identity no longer functioned as reliable guides to understanding who or what you were supposed to be. Washington appeared through clouds like a city constructed from fever dreams, its monuments white and solemn against the winter sky, its streets crowded with traffic that moved with purposeful urgency, while William sat in another dark car that glided through it all with the smooth inevitability of official business. They took him to a hotel near the capital, a place of marble lobbies and hushed efficiency, where staff treated him with a reverence that made his skin crawl because it was based on some misunderstanding of who he was, some story they had been told that bore no resemblance to the truth of his unremarkable existence. His room was larger than his living room at home, appointed with furniture that looked too expensive to actually use, and he stood at the window for a long time, watching the city move below him, thousands of people pursuing purposes he could not fathom, living lives that intersected with power and history in ways his own never had, except for this strange accident of having once given something away and now being summoned to receive it back. A young aide knocked on his door an hour after his arrival, introducing herself as Jennifer and explaining the schedule for tomorrow's ceremony, when the car would collect him, what he should wear, where he would be seated, when the president would arrive, and what would happen during the event itself, all delivered in a cheerful, efficient tone that suggested this was perfectly normal. That old men were flown across the country to be honored in public ceremonies every day, that there was nothing extraordinary about any of this, despite the fact that for William it felt like the most surreal experience of his entire 95 years. He slept poorly in the unfamiliar bed, the pillows too soft and the darkness too complete. The silence of the hotel room, oppressive in its totality, because it lacked the familiar sounds of his house settling, or the distant traffic on the street outside his window in Cedar Rapids. He woke repeatedly, disoriented and anxious, his heart racing with the kind of panic that had no specific object, but saturated everything with dread, and by the time morning arrived, he felt more exhausted than he had before attempting sleep, his body aching in new and inventive ways that reminded him just how far he was from home and how little reserve he had left for experiences that required adaptation or resilience. Breakfast was brought to his room on a cart covered with silver domes that concealed food he barely touched, his stomach too tight with nerves to accept nourishment, and when the aide returned to collect him, she made no comment on the untouched meal, but simply smiled and asked if he was ready, as though readiness were a state he could achieve through simple decision, rather than something that required preparation he had not received and could not now improvise. They dressed him in a new suit that had been delivered while he slept, dark blue fabric that fit him surprisingly well, given that no one had measured him. And he stared at his reflection in the full-length mirror and saw a man who looked vaguely respectable, almost distinguished, nothing like the shabby recluse he knew himself to be beneath the costume of this borrowed dignity. The ceremony was to be held in the East Room of the White House, and as the car approached that famous building, William felt his chest tighten with something between awe and terror, because this was a place he had only seen in photographs and television broadcasts, a symbol so far removed from his own reality that actually entering it felt like trespassing, like he would be caught at any moment and exposed as an imposter who had no right to be here among the powerful and the celebrated. But the guards waved them through with sharp salutes, and the car pulled around to a side entrance, where Jennifer helped him out and guided him through hallways lined with portraits of former presidents whose painted eyes seemed to follow him with expressions of judgment or curiosity, or perhaps just indifference to this old man shuffling through their domain. The East Room was already filling with people when they arrived, press photographers jockeying for position, military officers in dress uniforms heavy with medals, politicians whose faces William vaguely recognized from television news, all gathered for reasons he could not fully comprehend, because surely this ceremony could not be solely for him, could not be justified by the simple act of one old veteran giving away a medal 20 years ago to a family he did not know. Jennifer seated him in a chair at the front of the room, facing rows of seats that were rapidly filling with strangers who glanced at him with polite interest before returning to their conversations, and he sat there feeling like a specimen under glass, like something being displayed for examination, rather than a participant in whatever was about to unfold. The room fell silent when the president entered, the sudden hush so complete that William could hear his own breathing, ragged and shallow, as Marcus Carter strode to the podium with the confident bearing of a man who belonged in spaces like this, who had earned his presence here through elections and accomplishments, while William's presence remained inexplicable, unearned, a mistake that everyone was too polite to acknowledge. The president looked older than the boy William remembered, naturally, but there was something in his eyes that was the same. That quality of intense attention, of seeing more than most people looked for. And when those eyes found William sitting in his chair at the front of the room, the president's expression shifted into something William could not quite name, something between gratitude and sorrow and a fierce determination that made the old veteran want to look away, but found he could not. The president began to speak, his voice carrying easily through the room without microphones, because the space was designed for oratory, for words that shaped history and moved nations. And he told a story William had almost forgotten, told it with detail and emotion that suggested he had carried it with him for decades, polished it in memory until it shone with significance William had never intended to create. He spoke about his father's death, about the grief that had threatened to drown his family, about an old veteran who appeared at the funeral and gave away the most precious thing he owned because he believed that sacrifice should be recognized and that his own survival diminished his right to claim honor that belonged to the dead. The president's voice caught briefly when he spoke about his mother, about her insistence that William O'Connor's gift had been sacred, that it represented a kind of courage deeper than battlefield heroism because it required giving up glory rather than claiming it. And William felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, though he tried to blink them away because crying here in front of cameras and strangers felt like weakness, like another failure to maintain the dignity he barely possessed. Marcus Carter explained that his mother had made him promise to find the veteran who gave them his medal, to thank him properly and tell him that his gift had shaped Marcus's entire life, had been the foundation of his mother's healing and his own sense of purpose, that every achievement Marcus had earned could be traced back to that moment in the funeral home when an old man with trembling hands taught him what real honor looked like, not the wearing of medals, but the giving of them away, not the accumulation of recognition, but the surrender of it in service of something larger than personal pride. And now, the president said, his voice growing stronger as he reached the climax of his narrative, now he wanted to return that medal to its rightful owner, not because the gift had been unappreciated or unwanted, but because 20 years had taught him that some acts of generosity create debts that can only be repaid through public acknowledgement, through testimony that ensures the story does not disappear into the silence of private memory, but becomes part of the nation's collective understanding of what service and sacrifice actually mean when stripped of rhetoric and reduced to their essential truth. The president stepped away from the podium and approached William, and the old veteran struggled to stand, his legs shaking and unreliable, his breathing labored from the effort and the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm the fragile composure he had maintained through sheer force of will. Marcus Carter held the medal in its velvet box, the same box William had pressed into his mother's hands 20 years ago, and he opened it slowly so that everyone in the room could see the ribbon and the metal gleaming under the chandelier light. "Sergeant William O'Connor," the president said, his voice formal now, weighted with the gravity of official recognition, "my father would have wanted you to keep this. You honored him, and now I honor you. This medal belongs to you, not just because you earned it in combat, but because you proved that the courage it represents extends beyond warfare into the harder battles of choosing humility over pride, generosity over possession, and the needs of others over your own need to be remembered. You gave this away because you believed my father was the real hero. But in doing so, you taught me what heroism actually looks like when it lives in the world rather than in stories we tell ourselves to make sense of violence and loss. Please accept this medal again, not as a return of property, but as recognition that your sacrifice, both on the battlefield and in that funeral home, has never been forgotten and will now never be forgotten. Because I have the power to make sure this story is told, and I intend to use that power to honor you the way you honored my family when we needed it most. The president held out the box, and William took it with hands that would not stop shaking, and as his fingers closed around velvet and metal and ribbon and all the meanings they carried, something broke open inside him. Some dam that had held back decades of grief and guilt and resignation, and he wept openly, helplessly, in front of cameras and strangers, and the President of the United States wept for the boy he had been, and the men who died, and the years he spent believing his survival was a cosmic mistake, wept with a kind of relief that felt like being forgiven, for sins he could finally believe might not have been sins after all, but simply the ordinary failures of being human in circumstances designed to break anyone who tried to maintain their humanity. The applause that filled the East Room after William accepted the medal was thunderous, overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to press against his chest and make breathing even more difficult than his tears had already rendered it. And he stood there, clutching the velvet box, while strangers rose to their feet and clapped with an enthusiasm that felt disconnected from anything he understood about himself or his life or the gesture they were celebrating. The president embraced him, carefully, aware of the old man's fragility, and in that brief moment of contact, William felt the solidity of Marcus Carter's presence, the warmth of living flesh, and the strength of someone decades younger whose vitality was a stark reminder of how close William stood to his own extinction. When they separated, the president kept one hand on William's shoulder as though to steady him, or perhaps to anchor him to this moment, to prevent him from drifting back into the obscurity he had inhabited for so long. And William was grateful for the physical support because his legs felt increasingly unreliable beneath him, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and emotion and the shock of being thrust so suddenly from invisibility into this blazing spotlight that revealed every crack and fissure in his carefully constructed isolation. Jennifer appeared at his side, guiding him back to his chair, while the ceremony continued with other speakers. Military officials who praised his service, historians who contextualized his Medal of Honor within the broader narrative of the Korean War, politicians who connected his story to contemporary debates about how the nation should honor its veterans. And William sat through it all in a daze, barely processing the words because his mind was still caught in the moment of receiving the medal back, still trying to understand what it meant, and whether he had been wrong all these years to believe his unworthiness was an immutable fact, rather than a story he told himself to make sense of surviving when better men did not. After the ceremony ended and the formal portion concluded, he was ushered into a smaller room where refreshments had been laid out on tables covered with white cloths, and people approached him one by one to shake his hand and offer words of gratitude or admiration that he accepted with awkward nods because he did not know how to respond to praise he still did not believe he deserved. Some were veterans themselves, old men like him, whose bodies carried the signatures of wars fought decades ago, and with these men he felt a brief kinship, a recognition that passed between them without need for words because they all understood the particular loneliness of surviving while others died. The guilt that never fully dissolved, no matter how many people called you hero or how many years separated you from the day you failed to die alongside your friends. But most who approached were younger, people who knew war only through films and history books, whose gratitude felt sincere but also abstract, disconnected from the visceral reality of what combat actually entailed, and William found himself nodding and smiling mechanically while his mind drifted elsewhere, back to Cedar Rapids and his small house and the routines that had structured his days for so long that their absence now created a vertiginous sense of being unmoored from everything familiar. The president appeared periodically, moving through the crowd with practiced ease, stopping occasionally to speak with William, asking questions about his health and his life with genuine interest that seemed impossible given how busy Marcus Carter must be, how many demands must be pulling at his attention even during this personal event. At one point, when the crowd had thinned slightly and William sat exhausted in a chair against the wall, the president pulled up another chair and sat beside him, and they remained in silence for a moment, two men separated by decades and circumstances, but connected by a single act that had rippled across time in ways neither could have predicted. "I need you to know something," Marcus said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that others could not overhear. "I need you to understand that what you did saved my mother's life. She was drowning in grief after my father died. She wanted to follow him. I could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at his photograph, the way she moved through the house like she was already a ghost. But your gift gave her something to hold on to, something that said her pain was witnessed and honored by someone who understood what my father's death actually meant, beyond the abstract language of duty and sacrifice. She used to stand in front of that medal late at night, and I would hear her talking to it, talking to you through it, and slowly she came back to us, came back to herself. You saved her, and in saving her you saved me, because I don't know who I would have become if I had lost both my parents that year." William listened to these words with something approaching wonder, because it had never occurred to him that his gesture might have had such concrete effects, that giving away the medal might have done something beyond assuaging his own guilt or making a symbolic point about where honor rightfully belonged. He tried to speak, to articulate something of what he felt, but words failed him, as they so often did when emotions grew too large for the narrow channel of language to accommodate. And instead he simply placed his weathered hand on Marcus Carter's arm and squeezed gently, hoping the gesture conveyed what his voice could not: gratitude for being told that his life had mattered after all, that the gesture he made in that funeral home had been more than self-erasure, that maybe survival was not the cosmic accident he had always believed it to be, but rather a necessary precondition for this moment, for this connection, for the possibility that one person's kindness could become the foundation of another person's entire existence and eventually ripple outward to touch millions of lives through the policies and leadership of a president who traced his moral compass back to an old veteran's trembling hands and willingness to give away glory in order to comfort strangers. They sat together for several more minutes, not speaking, just existing in each other's presence, while the reception continued around them, and William felt something he had not experienced in decades, a sense of completion, as though a circle that began the day he gave away his medal had finally closed, not in the way he expected or planned, but in a way that suggested the universe occasionally paid attention to small acts of decency, and sometimes, against all probability, arranged for them to be acknowledged and returned in forms that transformed both the giver and the receiver into something neither could have become alone. Eventually, Jennifer approached to tell him that his car was ready, that they should begin the journey back to the airport so he could return home before evening, and William felt both relief at the prospect of leaving this overwhelming intensity and a strange reluctance to step back into his ordinary life now that he had briefly touched something larger and more meaningful. The president walked him to the car, ignoring the aides who tried to pull him toward other obligations. And before William climbed into the back seat, Marcus handed him a phone number written on a small card. "Call me," he said simply. "Any time you want to talk. I mean that. You're not alone anymore, William. You never were, actually, but I know it must have felt that way. Don't let it feel that way again." William took the card, knowing he would probably never use it because the distance between his small life and the president's enormous responsibilities was too vast to bridge through casual phone conversations. But he was grateful for the gesture, for the acknowledgement that their connection was real, even if circumstances made its maintenance nearly impossible. He clutched the medal box in his lap during the drive to the airport, his fingers tracing the velvet surface as though trying to memorize its texture. And he thought about all the years he had spent believing he had severed his last connection to significance, only to discover that giving something away had created a bond stronger and more enduring than possession ever could have forged. The flight home was quieter than the journey to Washington, the plane cutting through darkness now as February evening settled over the country, and William watched his reflection in the window, an old man's ghostly face superimposed over clouds and stars, and tried to understand who he was now that his narrative had been forcibly rewritten by someone with the power to make the world pay attention. He was still William O'Connor, still 95 years old and failing, still haunted by memories of men who died before they could grow old enough to experience the ambiguous grace of being remembered. But something had shifted. Some fundamental assumption about his own worthlessness had been challenged, if not entirely displaced. And he carried the medal not with pride exactly, but with a kind of bewildered acceptance that maybe he had been wrong about some things, that maybe survival did not disqualify him from honor, but rather obligated him to live in ways that justified the gift of continued existence, when so many others had been denied that gift. The certainty that had defined his last 20 years, the conviction that giving away the medal was his final, meaningful act, had been replaced by uncertainty, by the unsettling possibility that his story was not yet finished, that even at 95, with death hovering close enough to feel its cold breath on his neck, there might still be chapters unwritten and purposes yet to be discovered in the small space between this moment and whatever came next. When he arrived back in Cedar Rapids, the house looked exactly as he had left it, but he experienced it differently now, as though he had been gone years rather than a single night, as though the journey to Washington had been a kind of death and resurrection that altered perception even when circumstances remained unchanged. He placed the medal on the mantel where it caught lamplight and gleamed with a quiet authority that transformed the shabby room into something approaching sacred space, and he sat in his chair, staring at it for a long time, remembering the boy Marcus had been and the man he had become, thinking about the mysterious ways that human connections formed and persisted across decades, despite all the forces that should have erased them into insignificance. He slept better that night than he had in years, his dreams still populated by ghosts, but gentler ones now, men who looked at him without accusation or judgment, who seemed almost to nod in approval, as though releasing him from obligations he had imposed on himself and they had never asked him to carry. And when he woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through his window and birds beginning their spring songs, despite winter's continued grip on the landscape, William O'Connor understood that he had been given something more precious than a medal. He had been given permission to believe that his life mattered, that his survival had been necessary for reasons beyond his comprehension, and that the years remaining to him, however few they might be, could be lived with something approaching peace if he could learn to accept grace when it arrived, wearing unexpected faces and speaking words he never imagined he deserved to hear. The weeks following William's return from Washington unfolded with a strange new rhythm. His days still structured by familiar routines, but infused now with an undercurrent of meaning that had been absent for so long he barely recognized it when it appeared. The medal remained on the mantel, visible from multiple angles throughout the main room of his house, and he found his eyes drawn to it constantly, not with the old shame and guilt that had driven him to give it away, but with something closer to curious acceptance, as though the object had transformed through its journey away and back into something different from what it had been. No longer a symbol of unworthiness, but rather evidence of a story larger than he had understood himself to be living. Neighbors who had previously barely acknowledged his existence began stopping by with regularity that surprised him. Having seen news coverage of the ceremony or heard through the efficient networks of small-town gossip about the local veteran who had been honored by the president, and though their attention made him uncomfortable, their questions about the ceremony, their requests to see the medal, their sudden interest in his wartime service, he found himself less able to retreat into silence and isolation than he once had been, as though the very public nature of his recognition had demolished the protective walls he had built around himself and left him exposed to human connection, whether he welcomed it or not. A journalist from the local paper called, requesting an interview, and after initial resistance, William agreed. Sitting in his living room while a young woman barely older than his grandchildren would have been if he had ever had children asked him questions about career and the medal, and what it felt like to have the president return something he had given away. He answered haltingly, struggling to articulate thoughts he had never before attempted to speak aloud, and when the article appeared the following week, he barely recognized himself in the quotes attributed to him. He sounded wiser and more reflective than he believed himself to be, his fragmented responses edited into coherent statements that made his life seem purposeful, rather than accidentally stumbled through in a fog of survival and regret. The paper included a photograph of him holding the medal, and he stared at his own image for a long time, seeing not the broken old man he felt himself to be, but rather someone who looked dignified in his age, whose eyes held depths the camera had somehow captured, despite his belief that he contained no depths worth capturing, only shallow pools of guilt and loneliness that dried up long ago. The article generated unexpected responses. Letters arrived from other veterans, sharing their own stories, from strangers thanking him for his service, from a few people who had known men he served with and wanted to share memories of soldiers whose names he had not heard spoken aloud in decades, and each letter required a response, which meant William found himself writing more words in those weeks than he had written in the previous 20 years combined. He began venturing out more frequently, accepting invitations to speak at the local VFW hall, where old men gathered to drink coffee and tell stories that grew more mythological with each retelling. And though he had avoided such places for decades, uncomfortable with the way veterans romanticized their wars and turned horror into adventure through the alchemy of nostalgia, he found a different kind of conversation possible now. One that acknowledged both the necessity of what they had done and the cost it had extracted, the way military service had marked them all in ways that never fully healed, but which could be witnessed and honored without pretending the wounds were anything other than permanent. Some of these men had also struggled with survivor's guilt, had also spent years wondering why they were allowed to grow old, while their friends remained forever young in memory and photographs. And in sharing these feelings aloud, tentatively at first, then with increasing openness as others responded with recognition rather than judgment, William discovered a form of community he had not known existed, a fellowship of the damaged, who helped each other bear weight that could not be carried alone. They elected him to some honorary position he barely understood, asked him to participate in Memorial Day ceremonies, wanted his presence at events he would have previously avoided, and though part of him resisted this new visibility, another part, smaller but growing, recognized that isolation had not protected him from pain, but had merely concentrated it, turned it inward where it festered without witnesses, to help him process and release what could not be resolved, but could at least be shared. His health, paradoxically, seemed to improve slightly, as though having a reason to exist beyond simple biological continuation, gave his body permission to fight a little harder against entropy's pull, to marshal resources for engagement with the world that it had been withholding when existence felt purposeless and death seemed like relief rather than tragedy. He still ached, still moved slowly, still forgot things with increasing frequency, but the fog that had descended over his final years lifted somewhat, burned away by the warmth of human attention and the radical possibility that his story was not yet complete, that even at 95 he might still have contributions to make and purposes to serve if he could overcome the habit of self-erasure that had defined his last 2 decades. The president called twice in those weeks, brief conversations that never lasted more than a few minutes, but which meant more to William than he could express, because the most powerful man in the nation took time from impossible schedules to check on an old veteran in Iowa, to ask about his health and whether he needed anything, to remind him that the connection forged in that funeral home and renewed in the East Room was not merely ceremonial, but real, a bond that would persist regardless of distance or the vast disparity in their circumstances. During one of these calls, Marcus mentioned that he wanted to establish a foundation in his father's name, focused on supporting veterans and their families, and he asked if William would consider being on the advisory board, lending his name and experience to the effort, even if his age and health prevented active participation in day-to-day operations. William's first instinct was to refuse, to insist he had nothing to offer and would only be a symbolic figurehead whose presence served no practical purpose. But before he could voice these objections, he stopped himself, recognizing the pattern of self-diminishment that had governed his life for so long, and wondering if perhaps the greatest disrespect he could show to the president's gift would be to immediately retreat back into the conviction of his own worthlessness. So he agreed tentatively, with caveats about his limitations and concerns that he would disappoint expectations. And Marcus responded with warmth that suggested he had anticipated these objections and valued William's participation precisely because it would be tempered by humility and awareness of the complexity of what it meant to serve and survive and carry those experiences forward into a world that rarely understood either. The foundation would launch later that year, the president explained, and William's name would appear on materials alongside other advisors. His story used to illustrate the organization's values and inspire contributions from people moved by the narrative of sacrifice and recognition that had been so publicly celebrated. And though William felt uncomfortable with the idea of his life being used as inspiration, uncomfortable with having his private struggles transformed into public symbols, he understood that this discomfort was itself perhaps a form of privilege, the luxury of privacy, in an age where visibility was currency and anonymity was increasingly difficult to maintain. As winter began yielding reluctantly to early spring, as days lengthened and the grip of cold loosened its hold on the landscape, William found himself thinking less about the past and more about whatever time remained, however brief that might be. The medal on his mantle no longer felt like an accusation or a mistake, but rather like a bridge connecting different versions of himself across decades. The young soldier who earned it, the old veteran who gave it away, the ancient survivor who received it back, transformed by its journey through the life of a boy who became president. He understood now what Marcus had been trying to tell him in that smaller room after the ceremony, that the gift had never been about the medal itself, but about the connection it forged, about witnessing someone else's grief and responding with the only gesture of comfort available in that moment, however inadequate it felt. The medal was just metal and ribbon, but what it represented, the willingness to give away something precious because someone else needed it more. That was the real gift, and its return was not rejection, but confirmation that such gestures mattered, that they rippled outward in ways impossible to predict or measure, that one person's kindness could become another person's foundation and eventually transform into something that touched thousands of lives through the mysterious multiplication of grace when it moved through human hearts instead of being hoarded in private darkness. And so William O'Connor, at 95 years old with death no longer distant but immediate and hovering, allowed himself to believe, tentatively, cautiously, but with increasing conviction, that maybe his survival had not been accident or theft, but rather necessary preparation for this moment when his story could become useful to others. When his pain and his gesture and his long years of loneliness could be transformed into something redemptive, not just for himself, but for everyone who struggled with the impossible question of what it meant to deserve the life you were given when so many others were denied that gift through no fault or virtue of their own, but simply through the arbitrary cruelty of circumstance and fate and the mechanical indifference of violence that destroyed without meaning or purpose, or the slightest concern for human concepts of justice or desert. William O'Connor died on a morning in late May, when the world had fully committed to spring, and the garden behind his house bloomed with vegetables he had planted weeks earlier, with the tentative hope that he might survive to harvest them, his body simply choosing not to wake from dreams that had grown gentler in his final months, discovered peacefully by a neighbor who had formed the habit of checking on him daily, ever since the ceremony in Washington made everyone suddenly aware that a man of historical significance lived among them in quiet obscurity. The funeral was held in Cedar Rapids, at a small church that filled beyond capacity with veterans from across the region, with neighbors who had barely known him but felt they should be present, with journalists covering the death of the man whose story had briefly captured national attention, and sitting in the front row, having flown in as soon as he received news of William's death, was President Marcus Carter, who had cleared his schedule and ignored advisors who suggested that attending the funeral of a 95-year-old veteran was not an efficient use of presidential time and resources. The president gave the eulogy, speaking without notes, in a voice that carried the weight of genuine grief rather than political performance, telling the assembled gathering that William O'Connor had been the most important person in his life besides his parents, that a gesture made 23 years ago in a moment of profound generosity had shaped everything Marcus became and achieved. And he described visiting William just 2 weeks before his death, when the old veteran had gripped his hand with surprising strength and said the most important words he ever spoke. "I think I finally understand that surviving wasn't the wrong ending after all. I think maybe I was supposed to live long enough for this, to see that the giving mattered. Thank you for telling me that. And thank you for not letting me disappear." The ceremony concluded with full military honors, soldiers in dress uniform presenting the folded flag to the president as next of kin, since William had no family, and Marcus accepted it with the same reverence William had shown when receiving the Medal of Honor back in the East Room, understanding that these symbols meant nothing in themselves, but everything when they represented genuine human connection and the mysterious ways that one person's sacrifice could echo across time until it became part of the foundation upon which others built their lives and legacies. In the years that followed, the William O'Connor Foundation grew into one of the nation's most effective organizations, supporting military families, funded by donations from people moved by the story of an old veteran who gave away his Medal of Honor and the president who returned it, who turned a private gesture of generosity into a public testament to the values that make survival meaningful rather than merely biological. And gradually, William's name became shorthand for a particular kind of quiet heroism that existed outside the dramatics of battlefield valor. The heroism of continuing to live when death seemed easier, of reaching out to comfort strangers when your own pain felt overwhelming, of giving away the symbols of your significance because you believed someone else deserved them more, and of accepting their return when someone powerful enough to command attention insisted that your story needed to be told and your life needed to be honored regardless of your own protests and self-doubt. Marcus Carter served 2 terms as president, and in every major speech he gave about veterans or sacrifice or the meaning of service, he mentioned William O'Connor, keeping that name alive in the national consciousness long after the man himself had returned to dust, ensuring that the gesture made in a funeral home 23 years earlier would never be forgotten, but would instead become part of the permanent record of what it meant to be truly honorable in a world that too often confused glory with goodness and recognition with worth, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in quiet rooms where broken people choose to give away their last proof of mattering because they believe someone else's grief deserves witness, and that such gestures, when received with gratitude and returned with love, can transform not just 2 lives, but thousands, rippling outward through time, until a single moment of selfless compassion becomes the foundation upon which entire legacies are built. And nations remember what service actually means when stripped of rhetoric and reduced to its purest essence. One human being reaching across the abyss of loss to tell another that their pain is seen, their sacrifice honored, and their life worth infinitely more than any medal could ever represent.